There are moments in sports when two completely different stories collide around the same person at the same time, and the temptation is always to pick one and ignore the uncomfortable questions, to focus on the good news and wave away the uncomfortable questions, or to lean into the controversy and dismiss the genuine achievements as a distraction. Neither approach is honest. And with everything swirling around Caitlin Clark and the Indiana Fever right now, dishonesty is the one thing this situation absolutely cannot afford. Because what is happening around this player right now exists on two completely opposite ends of the spectrum. One story is celebratory in a way that goes far beyond basketball. It is the kind of recognition that cities reserve for figures who have genuinely changed the cultural identity of a place. The other story is uncomfortable, documented, and impossible to explain away with organizational messaging or diplomatic silence. Both are real. Both are happening simultaneously. And the fact that they are happening at the same time, around the same player, within the same franchise, is itself the story that deserves the most serious examination. Let us start with the news that reflects what Caitlin Clark has built, because it is genuinely extraordinary and it deserves to be understood in its full context before anything else is discussed. Caitlin Clark has been named the Grand Marshal of the Indianapolis 500. Take a moment with that sentence, because if you let it pass quickly, you will miss what it actually communicates. The Indianapolis 500 is not a local celebration. It is not a regional sporting event that generates modest national attention and then disappears from the broader cultural conversation. It is one of the most iconic, most globally recognized sporting events in American history. Over a century of tradition, hundreds of millions of people around the world who know exactly what it is and what it represents. When the organizers of that event decide who stands at the symbolic center of it, who serves as the face of that moment for the entire watching world, they are making a statement about who matters, who commands genuine cultural attention, and who has earned the kind of public significance that the Grand Marshal role is designed to honor. The answer they arrived at was a professional basketball player who has been in Indianapolis for 2 years. Not a politician, not a civic institution, not a figure with decades of community investment and historical ties to the city. A basketball player, a 20-something who arrived in Indianapolis in 2024 and proceeded to transform the entire identity of women's professional sports in America within a time frame that nobody in the history of the league had ever managed before. That is what the Grand Marshal designation communicates. Indianapolis is not simply celebrating a good basketball player. Indianapolis is acknowledging that Caitlin Clark is the most culturally significant figure this city has produced in a generation, and they are placing her at the center of their most important annual moment to make that acknowledgement visible to the entire world. That is not a small thing. That is not a routine sports honor that gets filed away alongside the other accolades and forgotten by the following news cycle. That is a city telling you who it believes it is and answering that question with her name. And when you understand the full weight of what the Indianapolis 500 Grand Marshal role actually represents, historically and culturally, the decision becomes even more striking. Because the people making that decision are not basketball people. They are not WNBA executives or women's sports advocates looking for an opportunity to elevate a player they already believe in. They are the stewards of one of the oldest and most prestigious motorsport events on the planet. And they looked at the cultural landscape of Indianapolis in 2025 and concluded that no figure better represents this city's place in the national conversation than Caitlin Clark. That conclusion did not come from nowhere. It came from 2 years of evidence that is impossible to argue with. Before the conversation shifts to the uncomfortable questions, it is worth spending a moment with the numbers and the reality of what Clark has constructed in Indianapolis, because it is the foundation on which everything else in this story rests. She arrived as the most anticipated rookie in the history of women's professional basketball. The expectations placed on her were not reasonable. They were not the kind of expectations any human being could realistically meet without cracking under the weight of them. Every game was a national television event. Every performance was dissected by millions of people who had never previously watched a WNBA game in their lives. Every mistake was amplified, and every achievement was simultaneously celebrated and held up as evidence that the celebration itself was somehow excessive or misplaced. She met those expectations anyway. She is leading the league in scoring. She is doing it while navigating a professional environment that the documented record of this season has revealed to be significantly more complicated and more strained than any franchise in its right mind would want its most important player operating within. She is doing it while carrying the commercial weight of an entire organization on her back, while being the reason that Indiana Fever games are sold out, while being the reason that national broadcast partners are paying attention to women's professional basketball in ways they never had before. She is the engine. She is the reason the franchise exists in its current form, commercially, culturally, and competitively. Without her, the Indiana Fever is a mid-market WNBA team with modest attendance figures and limited national profile. With her, it is the most discussed, most watched, most commercially significant franchise in the league. The Indianapolis 500, people understand that. That is why they made the call they made. The question now is whether the people inside the Indiana Fever organization understand it with the same clarity. Because the second story surrounding this player right now suggests that somewhere between the boardroom and the basketball court, that understanding has not translated into the organizational behavior it demands. And that is where this gets genuinely uncomfortable. This did not start with one incident. That is the first thing to understand about what the documented record shows. One incident can be contextualized. One moment can be framed as a misread situation, a brief lapse in professional judgment, an isolated occurrence that does not reflect a broader pattern of behavior. One incident is something an organization can address quietly and move forward from without the story taking on a life of its own. This is not one incident. Multiple pieces of footage have circulated across the course of this season, showing members of the Fever coaching staff engaging in physical contact with Caitlin Clark during games in ways that she has visibly and repeatedly responded to with discomfort, resistance, and attempts to create physical distance. The footage is not ambiguous. It is not the kind of material that requires extensive interpretation or the application of generous framing to understand. You watch it and you see what you see. A player pulling away, a player creating distance, a player whose body language in these specific moments communicates with unmistakable clarity that the physical contact being initiated by members of her own coaching staff is not something she is comfortable with in the manner it is being delivered. The most prominent of these documented moments involves Stephanie White, the head coach of the Indiana Fever, and an interaction captured on camera that has since been circulated widely enough that it has become a reference point in the broader conversation about Clark's relationship with this coaching staff. Clark pulls her hand away. The gesture is not subtle. It is not the kind of reflexive movement that could reasonably be interpreted as something other than what it is. It is a direct, visible, physical expression of a player establishing that the contact being initiated is not welcome in that moment. And the detail that makes this particular incident more significant than it might otherwise be is who else was present when it happened. Amber Cox, the president and CEO of the Indiana Fever, was there. Another organizational figure was there. They observed the exchange. And the question of what organizational leadership does in that moment, whether they intervene, whether they address it, whether they treat the visible discomfort of their most valuable player as something requiring immediate attention, is a question that the subsequent organizational silence has answered in a way that raises more concerns rather than fewer. The Stephanie White footage is the most discussed of these documented moments, but it is far from the only one. and the fact that multiple members of the coaching staff appear in the documented record of these incidents is what elevates this from a conversation about one person's coaching style to a conversation about the broader culture of the staff that came to Indianapolis with Stephanie White. Brianne January, an assistant coach on the Fever staff, has appeared in footage that observers have described as showing a pattern of engagement with Clark that reads as persistent, intrusive, and unwelcome. The specific interactions captured on camera involve repeated physical approaches and contact that Clark's visible responses suggest she is not receiving as normal coaching communication. This is not a coach briefly touching a player's shoulder during a timeout and moving on. The footage that has circulated suggests something more persistent, more repeated, and more clearly unwelcome based on Clark's visible reactions to it. There is also footage involving another member of the coaching staff approaching Clark from across the court in a moment when Clark was engaged with the crowd, initiating contact in a context that Clark had not sought and did not visibly welcome. The specific circumstance of that interaction, the fact that it happened when Clark was in the middle of engaging with fans rather than in a coaching context where physical communication would be routine and expected, makes the choice to approach her and initiate contact in that moment a particularly notable data point in the broader pattern.
Taken individually, any one of these documented moments might be explained away. Coaches touch players. That is a normal part of the physical communication of athletic coaching environments. Nobody is suggesting that any physical contact between a coach and a player is automatically problematic. That is not the argument. The argument is about what Clark's visible, repeated, documented responses to these specific interactions tell you about how she is receiving them, and what the pattern of those responses across multiple incidents involving multiple staff members says about the professional environment she is operating within. In any professional workplace outside of sports, the visible and repeated discomfort of an employee regarding physical contact initiated by supervisors is treated as a matter requiring organizational attention. It is not minimized. It is not rationalized as a misreading of normal professional behavior. It is not addressed through strategic silence and positive messaging about team culture. It is taken seriously, investigated, and acted upon. The fact that the setting is a professional sports organization does not change the fundamental professional responsibility that organizational leadership carries when this kind of documented pattern becomes visible. The specific detail of Amber Cox being present during one of these documented physical contact incidents and not visibly intervening is something that cannot be passed over quickly, because it tells you something important about the organizational culture and the priority hierarchy within this franchise. Cox is the president and CEO of the Indiana Fever. She is the person at the top of the organizational chart below the ownership level. Her presence at these games, her proximity to these interactions, and her observable response to what she witnesses in those moments is a reflection of organizational leadership in its most direct and unmediated form. When the most important player in your franchise visibly pulls away from physical contact initiated by your head coach in a moment that is captured on camera and subsequently watched by millions of people, what does the person at the top of your organizational structure do? The documented answer, based on what the record of this season shows, appears to be not enough. And that answer has consequences. Not just for the specific incidents it fails to address, but for the message it sends throughout the organization about what standards of professional behavior are being enforced and what the front office's actual priorities are when organizational comfort and player well-being come into conflict. When an organization's most commercially valuable, most culturally significant, most publicly celebrated player is demonstrating visible and repeated discomfort with her working environment, and organizational leadership observes that discomfort firsthand and responds with silence, the silence is itself a statement about organizational values. It is a statement that the fan community surrounding this team has read clearly.
The boycott movements that emerged during this season, the formal resistance organizations that coalesced around specific organizational decisions, the sustained public criticism of Fever leadership that has been a consistent background noise throughout this entire season, none of that materialized out of nowhere. It emerged from a community of people who have been watching the same footage, processing the same documented incidents, and arriving at conclusions about this franchise's relationship with its most important player that organizational messaging has consistently failed to counteract. Because messaging cannot counteract footage, words cannot overwrite what people have already seen with their own eyes. There is a comparison that keeps appearing in the conversation about Clark's relationship with the current Fever coaching staff, and it is worth examining carefully because it illuminates the current situation in ways that abstract analysis cannot. Lisa Bluder coached Caitlin Clark at Iowa. She was the architect of the environment in which Clark became not just the greatest scorer in the history of college basketball, but the most transformative individual force in the history of women's collegiate sports. What Bluder built at Iowa around Clark was not simply a good coaching relationship in the conventional sense of the phrase. It was a professional environment precisely calibrated to unlock the highest possible level of performance from a player whose gifts were as extraordinary as her needs were specific. Clark is not a player who can be coached through pressure and confrontation and the kind of physical and emotional dynamics that have characterized her documented interactions with the current Fever staff. She is a player who operates at her highest level within a framework of genuine trust, genuine communication, and a mutual understanding between coach and player about how that specific athlete processes information, responds to instruction, and maintains the competitive focus that elite-level basketball demands. Bluder understood that. Everything about the coaching environment Bluder created at Iowa reflected that understanding. The visible discomfort Clark has demonstrated repeatedly and publicly with the current coaching staff's approach is not a random occurrence. It is not the product of a difficult personality or an unwillingness to be coached. It is the human expression of the gap between a coaching environment built on genuine trust and mutual understanding and a coaching environment that has spent an entire season failing to establish that foundation. Professional athletes at the highest level of their sport develop specific, legitimate, hard-earned preferences about how they are coached, how they are communicated with, and how their physical and professional space is respected within the working environment of their organization.
Those preferences are not demands. They are not expressions of ego or entitlement. They are the product of years of competitive experience that has taught a player exactly what conditions she needs to perform at her absolute best. When a player of Clark's caliber is communicating through repeated, documented, visible behavior that something about her current coaching environment is not working for her, that is not a player problem. That is information. And information of that significance, delivered that consistently through that many documented incidents, demands an organizational response that goes well beyond standard messaging about team chemistry and coaching philosophy. Here is the thing about the Indianapolis 500 Grand Marshal designation and the coaching environment concerns existing simultaneously. They do not cancel each other out. They do not exist in separate compartments that can be managed independently without acknowledging the tension between them. They are, in fact, connected dimensions of a single larger reality about who Caitlin Clark is, what she represents to this franchise, and what this franchise owes her in terms of organizational investment and professional respect. Think about what the Grand Marshal designation actually represents in this context. It represents Indianapolis telling the world that Caitlin Clark is the most culturally significant figure this city has produced in a generation. It represents the stewards of one of the oldest and most prestigious sporting events on the planet, concluding that no individual better embodies the identity and the national profile of this city right now than this player. It is an acknowledgement of cultural stature that goes far beyond anything the WNBA or the Indiana Fever specifically can confer. And simultaneously, the player who has achieved that level of cultural recognition is being documented across multiple incidents, pulling away from physical contact initiated by her own coaching staff, with organizational leadership present and observing in a professional environment that the entire documented record of this season has revealed to be characterized by friction, mistrust, and a pattern of organizational decisions that have generated genuine and sustained public resistance. Those two realities cannot comfortably coexist. They cannot be managed into a comfortable synthesis through careful communication strategy. They create a tension that demands resolution, and the only resolution available is organizational action that brings the professional environment Clark is operating within into alignment with the standard her cultural status and her commercial importance to this franchise clearly demand. She is still producing. She is still leading the league in scoring. She is still the reason people are watching, the reason seats are filled, the reason national broadcast partners have the women's game on their radar in ways that were unimaginable 5 years ago. She is doing all of that while navigating a professional environment that the documented record says is not giving her what she needs, not respecting the boundaries she is clearly communicating, and not delivering the organizational response that the pattern of these incidents obviously requires. That is an extraordinary level of professional resilience, but resilience is not the same as sustainability. And an organization that is relying on its most important players' resilience to compensate for its own failure to address documented and visible problems with her professional environment is an organization that is spending down a form of credit it cannot afford to exhaust. The Indiana Fever exists in its current form, commercially and culturally and competitively, because of what Caitlin Clark has given to it. That is not an opinion. That is the observable reality of what has happened to this franchise since she arrived. The attendance figures, the broadcast deals, the national attention, the cultural significance, the Grand Marshal designation itself, all of it flows from what she has built here and what she continues to build despite everything the documented record of this season reveals about the environment she is building it within. That reality carries an obligation. It carries an obligation that goes well beyond the standard responsibilities an organization has to any employee or any athlete. When a player has given a franchise everything she has given this one, when a player has transformed the entire identity and commercial profile of an organization in the way Clark has transformed this one, the organization's responsibility to that player is not simply to pay her contract and show up to her games. The obligation is to ensure that every element of the professional environment surrounding her reflects the full weight of what she is and what she has given. Every interaction, every communication, every decision about how coaches approach her during games and how her physical and professional space is respected in those moments. Every organizational response to the documented evidence of discomfort and friction that has accumulated across this entire season, all of it needs to be measured against the standard that the reality of her cultural and commercial importance to this franchise clearly demand. The Indiana Fever front office knows what that standard requires. Amber Cox knows what that standard requires. The coaching staff knows what the documented record of player discomfort and visible friction is telling them about the gap between their current approach and what that standard demands. The question, and it is the central question that everything surrounding this franchise right now comes back to, is whether the organizational will exists to close that gap in the ways the evidence clearly demands, or whether the pattern of this season continues into the next chapter.
When the Indianapolis 500 named Caitlin Clark its Grand Marshal, they were doing something that sports honors rarely actually accomplish. They were capturing, in a single designation, the complete reality of what one person has meant to a city and to a cultural moment. They were saying, this person changed something here. This person arrived and made Indianapolis matter in a way it had not mattered before in this specific context, and the significance of that transformation deserves to be honored at the highest level this city can offer. That is a remarkable thing, and it deserves to be celebrated without reservation. But celebrations do not resolve organizational failures. Grand Marshal designations do not address documented patterns of unwelcome physical contact. Cultural honors do not substitute for the organizational action that the full body of evidence from this season has been demanding for months. If anything, the honor sharpens the urgency of the questions it cannot answer. Because what does it say about an organization when the player it has sent to stand at the center of the Indianapolis 500, the player it has allowed to become the symbolic face of this entire city, is simultaneously the player who has been documented pulling away from physical contact initiated by her own coaching staff, with organizational leadership watching and not intervening across multiple incidents throughout a season that the broader fan community has been watching with growing alarm. It says that the organization has allowed a gap to develop between the public image it benefits from and the private professional reality it is responsible for maintaining. It says that the commercial and cultural capital Clark has generated has not been matched by the organizational investment and professional respect that capital demands in return. And it says that the Indiana Fever front office has a decision to make about whether the second chapter of the Caitlin Clark era in Indianapolis is going to be defined by the kind of organizational excellence that her cultural stature demands, or by the continuation of a pattern that the documented record of this season has made impossible to ignore. She has done her part. She has done more than her part. She showed up in this city and she gave it something it will be talking about for decades. She earned the Indianapolis 500. She earned every honor and every designation and every piece of recognition that comes her way, and she is going to keep earning them because that is who she is and what she does, regardless of the environment around her. The question is not what Caitlin Clark is going to do next. The question is what the Indiana Fever is going to do about the gap between what they are celebrating and what the documented evidence of this season reveals about the professional environment they have built around the player they are celebrating. That question does not have a messaging answer. It only has an action answer. And the whole world is watching to see which one this organization chooses.